I call it kind of an elephant in the room hiding in plain sight that nobody seems to have noticed.
All the major climate models are missing one key variable, says John Clauser, winner of the 2022 Nobel Prize in Physics. He was one of the 2 Nobel laureates to sign a declaration by a global coalition of scientists stating there is no climate emergency.
This is clearly the most important mechanism that controls the climate, controls the temperature of the Earth, and stabilizes it very powerfully and very dramatically.
In this episode, Clauser breaks down how clouds and variations in cloud cover profoundly impact the climate. This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Dr. John Clauser, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Dr. Clauser, first of all, congratulations on winning the 2022 Nobel Prize for Physics in this realm, which I've always been absolutely fascinated with, quantum entanglement, spooky action as a distance, as it has been called. But you have actually been in the news recently over another issue, which is climate change. And I'm just very, very curious. Before we dive into this, how is it that you became involved in this? How is it that you got interested in this?
Well, I have been interested in climate science for most of its history, including back to Al Gore's original movie and the like. And I have been rather distressed about the poor quality of the science that is being done. And in fact, back around in 2010, there were any number of requests for comments by the American Physical Society, which I responded to, and all of which were totally ignored. And then when I was in Stockholm and talking to the prize committee, who awarded this my prize in physics, I pointed out to them that I disagreed with their 2021 Nobel Prize that they had given, that I believe that the dominant process in controlling the climate has been totally misidentified. They identify it as due to carbon dioxide. I identify it totally differently. And if you go back through and read all of the various IPCC reports, the National Academy reports, the Royal Society reports, they all are totally clueless. And frequently even admit to being totally clueless as to the effects of clouds. Actually, one of the things that got me interested in studying this was I'm a sailboat racer. I raced across the Pacific Ocean at least a dozen times. And I remember lying in, I had set up my boat with solar panels to charge the batteries. And we were sailing along. I was lying in my berth, and I had an ammeter on the power output from the solar panels. And I noticed every time we sailed under a cloud, the output from the solar panels dropped by 50%. To half of its value that it was, and then we came out from behind the cloud and boom, their power went back up. And I thought, gee, I wonder why it's just about a factor of 2. And then I spent a fair amount of time staring at clouds, how they move, how they watch, just from sailing across the Pacific Ocean many times. One needs to study these things. And so I became very curious as to how clouds work. And then when the climate issues came along, I very quickly realized that cloud cover has a profound effect on the Earth's heat input, that the clouds are reflecting a massive amount of light back out into space. And so I then read all of the various IPCC reports, National Academy reports on this. As a physicist, I had worked at some excellent institutions, Caltech, Columbia, Cal Berkeley, where very careful science needed to be done. And reading these reports, I was appalled at how sloppy the work was. And in particular, it was very obvious, even in the earliest reports and all clear on through to the present, that clouds were not at all understood and were very poorly treated as just simply bad science.
Well, absolutely fascinating. And so, well, one quick question, okay? So I'm sure someone has said this to you, okay? You're, of course, an expert in quantum mechanics. Has anyone said to you, hey, stay in your lane, climate change isn't your thing?
Instead, what I was told when I was doing the quantum mechanics experiments was, oh, everybody knows the results of the experiment. It's unimportant. You're wasting your time. The experiments that I did that won the Nobel Prize, I was told very specifically, what a waste of time and effort. You're wasting money that could be otherwise spent doing some real physics.
That is absolutely astounding. Well, before we jump into the climate change stuff, why don't you just quickly explain to me, what your experiment found?
That was work that I did over 50 years ago when I was actually still started when I was still a graduate student at Columbia, and then where I read a fascinating paper by John Bell and realized that this was a way of settling a years-old argument between Niels Bohr and Albert Einstein. Actually, Albert Einstein, along with Erwin Schrödinger on one hand, and Niels Bohr along with John von Neumann on the other. And I realized that, number one, that they had never resolved the details of their discussion. And number two, that I could actually design an experiment to test and see which side of the argument was right. So I did exactly that. It showed that it's a very real process, and that that particles can remain entangled, quantum mechanically entangled, no matter how far apart they are separated. In my experiment, we had a pair of particles separated maybe 20 feet apart, and they were still entangled. Now experiments have been done where they're 1,000 kilometers apart and still remain entangled. And everybody told me at the time, well, you got the results that everybody expected. We all knew that Bohr was right and that Einstein was wrong, and it sort of got filed away and took 50 years to be recognized as as actually a rather important feature of physics. That quantum entanglement was not only misunderstood up till then, but was actually very useful. Once it became useful, that really kind of got people's attention. That was money coming in from CIA, NSA, who realized that it could be used for encrypted communication. So once money became part of the deal, everybody took notice.
And I just want to comment on this. When I first learned about this many, many years ago, of course it captured my and, millions of people's imagination that you have, one particle on one side, thousands of kilometers or millions of miles apart, and it changes its polarity, and the other one instantaneously changes as well.
Well, that's the tricky bit. You don't know. There are two questions. One is whether or not it has these properties to start with. So if you want to change the property of one of the particles, you need to claim that it indeed has the said properties. Effectively, what quantum mechanics says is it does not have these properties before you measure them. And what Bohr was arguing was, don't ask. why it doesn't. It just doesn't just accept it. I found that very disturbing and distressing to believe. I didn't understand it, and Einstein similarly didn't buy Bohr's arguments.
Well, but in the end, I think Bohr was vindicated, right, through your experiments, if I understand that correctly.
Einstein was clearly wrong. Einstein's whole program appears to be in shambles, including some of the fundamental pillars behind general relativity. But I don't know that Bohr's saying "don't ask, don't tell" is particularly satisfying either.
Well, so perhaps a topic for another show. And so let's dive into the climate change stuff here, which I find absolutely fascinating. Why don't you give me your case for how is it that clouds, which are obviously very, very important part of our system, have somehow been overlooked in these models?
Okay, that's an interesting history behind that. That goes back clear to the original National Academy report in 2003, and then percolated through all of the various IPCC reports. But I think one of the more important things that's happened recently is a gentleman, Steve Koonin, who was Barack Obama's science advisor, recently published a very important seminal book called Unsettled: What Climate Science Tells Us, What It Doesn't, and Why It Matters. It's a very important book. And his basic message is that the IPCC has 40 different computer models, all of which are making predictions, and all of which are being quoted by the press as predicting a climate crisis apocalypse. The problem is they all are in total disagreement, violent disagreement with each other in their predictions, and not one of them is capable of predicting retroactively, explaining the history of the Earth's climate for the last 100 years. He finds this very distressing, and he then correspondingly says or believes that there is some important, there's an important piece of physics that is missing in virtually all of these computer models. And so what I'm adding to the mix here is I believe I have the missing piece of the puzzle, if you will, that has been left out in virtually all of these computer programs, and that is the effect of clouds. The 2003 National Academy report totally admitted that they didn't understand it, and they made a whole series of mistaken statements regarding the effects of clouds. If you look at Al Gore's movie, he insists on talking about a cloud-free Earth, and the only way he can do this, he generates one for the mosaic of photos, each one taken on a cloudless day for covering the whole Earth. That's a totally artificial Earth, and is a totally artificial case for using a model, and this is pretty much what the IPCC and others use, is a cloud-free Earth. If you look at pictures of the Earth in visible light, i.e. real sunlight, which is, sunlight is the stuff that heats the Earth. The infrared re-radiation is the stuff that cools the Earth. And it's the balance between these two that controls the Earth's temperature. And the important piece of the puzzle that has been left out is trying to do this all with a cloud-free Earth when the real Earth is shrouded in clouds. I have some pictures, I don't know if you can show them, of satellite pictures of the Earth. These are all freely available on NASA's website, and they show cloud cover variations anywhere from 5 to 95%. Typically, the Earth is shrouded in clouds at least between a third of its area to 2/3 of its area. And it fluctuates. The cloud cover fraction fluctuates quite dramatically on daily, weekly time scales. We call this weather. You can't have weather without having clouds. And it is this fluctuation in cloud cover of the Earth that causes what I would refer to as sunlight reflectivity thermostat that controls the climate, controls the temperature of the Earth, and stabilizes it very powerfully and very dramatically. This mechanism, totally heretofore unnoticed, and I call it kind of an elephant in the room hiding in plain sight that nobody seems to have noticed. I can't imagine why not, but there were similar elephants in the room in quantum mechanics that I discovered. So the variation in the cloud cover, the importance in the actual power balance is 200 times more powerful than the the small effect by comparison of CO2. And I might add also of methane. Methane and CO2 are comparable in the total heat loss. So let me give you an example of how this mechanism works. Okay, first off, you have to notice that the Earth is 2/3 ocean. And that's where most of the importance of the clouds comes in. Sunlight is the heating mechanism. Clouds appear bright white. Ground, oceans, etc. are very dark and reflect very little light. But clouds reflect 90% of the sunlight that hits them gets reflected back out into space, where it no longer comes to the Earth, no longer heats the Earth. Say you only got a third of cloud cover. So you now have lots and lots of sunlight. Sunlight impinging on the ocean evaporates seawater. Seawater forms water vapor. The water vapor floats up into the sky and forms clouds. It forms lots and lots of clouds because the cloud creation rate is very high. But we started out with too low a set of clouds, and now we have an increasing number. So now we end up with very high cloud coverage. Okay, so now say it's 2/3. Well, let me give you an example. If you want to try to read a book on an overcast day indoors without turning the lights on, it's just too dark. You can't do it without turning the lights on. The question is, where did all that sunlight go? It's coming in scattered light coming in through the window, but boy, it's a lot darker now. So where did it go? There's only one place. It got scattered back out into space where it's no longer heating the Earth. So we now have the total power input coming to the Earth is now much, much smaller. Okay, well, this is happening on the oceans too. If you have large cloud cover, you have a lot of shadows. Clouds create shadows. You can see this by standing and watching clouds pass over. Well, the oceans are now shadowed. The shadows don't have enough energy to evaporate anywhere near as much water. So if we have too much cloud cover, then we reduce the evaporation rate of water. And so that then reduces the production of cloud. So we now have these two competing clouds. Okay, so the power loss is like 104 watts per square meter when we only have a third cloud cover, and 208 watts per square meter of surface area of the Earth when we have a very low cloud cover. So the difference between those is the order of 104 watts per square meter of surface area. That needs to be compared with this minuscule 0.5 watt per square meter of surface area that CO2 contributes. So the power in this thermostat, in terms of what they refer to as radiative forcing, These are the how many watts per square meter of surface area are involved. Is 200 times more powerful than the effect of CO2 and also methane, by the way. So I then assert that this is so powerful. I mean, it's like you have your house has a huge furnace with a very accurate thermostat controlling its temperature, and somebody leaves a small bathroom window and there's a small heat leak. Would the rest of the house notice a change in temperature? None of your thermostat is working very well. This is clearly the most important, the controlling mechanism for the Earth's temperature and climate, and it dwarfs the effect of CO2 and methane. All the government programs that are designed to limit CO2 and methane should be immediately dropped. We're spending trillions of dollars on this, and it's sort of like Everett Dirksen's famous line, a trillion here, a trillion there, and pretty soon you're talking real money.
Dr. Clauser, let me jump in here for a moment. Are you saying,
Sure.
and it's kind of common sense that cloud cover would play a role in these IPCC climate models, but are you suggesting that in none of these models the cloud cover is actually included?
Indeed, and in fact, Kunin mentions this in his book. They really didn't mention anything in the early IPCC reports, and finally, like in 2013, in the so-called AR5 report, they finally got a big section on clouds, and none of these properties that I have just mentioned. The fact that we have this huge fluctuation in cloud cover, the fact that the cloud reflectivity is varying by this huge amount of power loss out into space, none of that is mentioned. They all these models, and they've gone to great effort in saying, well, the Earth's albedo, okay, that's the average reflectivity of sunlight, if you will, the reflectivity fraction of sunlight. They all say, well, what is it? And it's 0.3, and even Kunin mentions, if we somehow it got raised to 0.31, that would only take a 5% increase in average cloud cover. That would totally wipe out any of the effects of say, doubling CO2. Nobody seems to notice that there's this huge variation from like 5% to 95% cloud cover, quite visible. I have no idea how they could have missed that.
What I'm hearing strains all credulity here, all semblance of credulity. So there's one factor of the albedo, which is this reflectivity measure, and it's just basically kept the same throughout all these different models, even though the reality is so dramatically different. Obviously,
it is kept the same, and in fact, there have been even worse. There have been any number of proposals, totally silly ideas, like painting all the roofs in the world white, all the highways white, and you can't see any roofs or from the satellite pictures. The total area of roofs is vanishingly small, and there's no way it's going to affect the power balance. And some of these proposals are all geoengineering proposals, solar radiation management proposals, are totally silly and outrageously expensive. We're talking for one of the proposals, talking about $1 trillion a year to spend on solar radiation management. What I am asserting here is that the Earth provides its own solar radiation management. It's built in, it occurs naturally, it works, it's very effective, and it's free. And you don't need to spend trillions of dollars per year.
Do you have any idea how something maybe so obvious, how there could be an oversight of this nature around something, a variable that's obviously incredibly important in this equation?
Well, I ran into two other, what I refer to as elephants in the room when I was studying quantum mechanics. So virtually all of the quantum mechanics experts and physicists in the world seem to have ignored some very simple and obvious when you see them and think about them, but not obvious if you haven't. Like, for example, this I discovered a point made by Max Born about how the difference between the two Schrödinger equations, that they're working in totally different spaces. And when Bohr was talking to Einstein, each one was assuming the other was working in a different space. One was working in configuration space, one was working in laboratory space. And for some reason, these two very bright guys didn't seem to notice that they were arguing past each other and then talking about formulations of the wave function in these two totally different spaces. This went on for 80 years until I pointed out in a recent paper. So yes, things like this do occur.
So are the IPCC modelers rushing to incorporate these changing variables of albedo according to actual, real measurements, for example?
Not to my knowledge, not yet. I haven't talked to any of the modelers, no, and no one has yet contacted me. In fact, this is the first. My comments to you and more recently and others are kind of the first revelation of all this.
Oh, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating, and I guess of profound significance, because this question of trying to mitigate anthropogenic climate change is become a dominant, kind of force in politics and basically how entire countries are organizing themselves.
I agree. The whole world is doing all of this. A lot of the pressure is actually coming from Europe, all of these various world conferences. All of this is coming, I'm guessing, started out by, initialized by Al Gore's movie. And Al Gore's movie has a lot of incorrect science built into it.
Well, so this is actually an interesting question as well. When we were talking offline, you mentioned, that in this area there's quite a bit of pseudoscience, essentially things that are accepted as true but that have not been rigorously proven by any means. But this is actually a general issue in many fields, not just in this one.
Some of it, in particular in climate change, is actually very dishonest disinformation that has been presented by various politicians. And one of the most important ones that I think has happened is done by NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Association. There was an article in 2013 in Physics Today. Physics Today is the standard technical news journal for physicists. And it was written by two non-scientists, Jane Lubachenko and Thomas Karl. Lubachenko was the Undersecretary of Commerce for climate change, and Carl was the director of NOAA for climate change, and they published a very an egregious piece of disinformation in Physics Today. How it got past referees, assuming there were referees for Physics Today, I don't know. But this was in the era when climate change was being rebranded. If you recall, originally we referred to this as global warming. And then all of a sudden, somewhere around 2013 or so, it got rebranded as climate change. And the question is, well, why is it, why are we changing the name? Well, the reason that was given at the time was, well, because it's really more than just warming. You know, nobody minds if it's a degree warmer, but it's the effects. The claimed effects are that we will have a dramatic increase in extreme weather events, landfalling hurricanes, hot spells, cold spells, floods, droughts, things, horrible things, apocalyptic things, if you will occur as a result of global warming, and so we're going to call it climate change. And so what this Physics Today article did, they produced a extreme weather event index, which somehow was some weighted average of number of droughts, floods, hurricanes, and the like. They then tallied from NOAA data what this index was for 100 years. And they then presented plots of this index value that they had for 100 years. And then in the headlines of their article, they said that the extreme weather events are all being caused by global warming, and that their frequency has been dramatically rising, especially in the last 3 decades. And so, okay, I became associated when I was working at Cal Berkeley on the quantum mechanics, my various experiments in quantum mechanics, with 2 very important Nobel laureates. One was Louis Alvarez, and one was Charlie Towns. Louis Alvarez is very famous for having developed the so-called 5 sigma criterion for believability of experiments in physics. Physics is the only one that uses that. The standard for believability, especially in medicine, in economics, and in particular in climate change, is far weaker. These 2 men would look at data like those presented by Lubachenko and Carl, and Alvarez would growl, rather gruff guy, and would say, "Flattest line I ever saw." And Charlie Towns was a bit more polite. He would say, "I don't see in the data what you're telling me that I am supposed to see." So what I did was I just simply traced out of the graphic, the printed in the article, their data, and I plotted it twice. Once forwards properly, and once time reversed, where I lived 100 years ago with today, and so that and vice versa, so that the arrow, the time was increasing to the left. You can't tell them apart. If you can't tell which way time is going, then it's very difficult to claim that it's obvious that the climate extremes index is increasing. And my question is, are you really willing to bet trillions of dollars that you know which is right? Is it really increasing? It is clearly not. Moreover, one of the things I noticed in reading Steve Koonen's book, conspicuously absent in their list of extreme weather events, is they left out EF3 plus tornadoes frequency. And if you added them in, it's actually clearly decreasing, because the frequency of high energy tornadoes has actually been decreasing, certainly in the last 50 years. So this, in my opinion, is a rather egregious breach of honesty by the U.S. government and by NOAA, and it is clearly done by political persuasion. How the mechanics of the political persuasion occurred, I have no idea. All I have noticed is that the Physics Today article is total crap.
You know, and not only, as I understand it, are these extreme weather events not increasing, but our ability to mitigate them has increased. So they're just not as much of an issue.
I don't think there's anything we can do. It's there. The weather is, I mean, Mark Twain's old line still applies. Everybody talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. Doing anything, that was what one of these geoengineering proposals are outrageously expensive, and they're totally ineffectual. There's no way you're going to have any effect. But by surprise is that people are upset with what I'm giving, I believe, to be good news. The good news is we don't need to. It's all the CO2 is just this worry about CO2, the worry about methane, the worry about global warming is all a total fabrication by shock journalists and or dishonest politicians.
Well, you know, there's a huge bureaucratic infrastructure, let's call it an industry, that's developed. I mean, I don't know what it's worth, but it's hundreds of billions of dollars, trillions. I don't know. It's very big, okay? And in the upper echelons of power related to this issue, right?
Yes. Well, I think one of the problems that I've been encountering is that once you have made a decision based on this incorrect information, you are pretty much wedded to defend it, and people in great power who have made these decisions are very unhappy having it revealed or being accused of having made incorrect trillion-dollar decisions.
So have you asked other scientists, or especially people involved in this specific field, to look at what you've discovered and give their opine on it from their expert perspective?
Yes, just recently, the text of the talk that I was going to give that I sent you, I have sent off, and I'm waiting for additional comments from Will Happer, who was Clinton's science advisor and runs the CO2 coalition, and Steve Koonen, who was Obama's climate advisor, who are very bright physicists. By various discussions with various other physicists, I have had no one who's been able to, or has shown me where I'm wrong. But it will take time to get studied.
So you're kind of making a project now of finding different elephants in the room, so to speak. Is that what I'm to understand?
Well, it's sort of what physicists do. That is noticing that the emperor is stark naked. The one problem that many have is, if you really look at data and you follow it, carefully, it may lead you to politically incorrect areas. Do you really want to go there? It doesn't bother me, but it bothers others, I guess. I personally am in favor of truth. That's what physicists do, is to discover natural truth.
Do you make a distinction with, this, let's say, politically motivated scientific literature and pseudoscience?
Indeed. Well, I gave a talk recently in Korea where I pointed out that there are really two different kinds of truth. There is what physicists do, or at least what we should do, is observe nature and make conclusions from what we actually see from our observations, from our experiments. That constitutes truth. If the experiments are done carefully and analyzed critically and peer-reviewed by others, that's what physicists do, is to cross-check each other's work and try to come up with new understanding. Businessmen, politicians, journalists, all have a very different mode of truth. That is perception of truth. Perception of truth is whether or not you can sell it. If you can sell it, it must be true. If you can't sell it, it must be false. Now, one of the differences between, this have nothing to do with the real truth, which is what you would get by measuring, going out and measuring it and getting real data as to what the truth is. But an important difference between the two kinds of truth is that perception of truth is malleable. That is, you can change it. So say you can't sell it, but you still want to sell it. That's all right. We'll just change the truth. How do we do that? Well, by advertising. We call it product differentiation. We want to show that there's a difference between our product and somebody else's product, even though there is none. So we create this difference. And we can change the truth, and whereas real truth you can't change. The experiments, the observations are true. For example, the IPCC perceives that the cloud cover is constant. And although clearly it does not agree with the observations, all you have to do is just look at the satellite pictures and you see that it's highly variable. This can be used in very dishonest ways by intentionally promoting false information, also known as disinformation. They call it promotion or advertising. When politicians and governments do it, they call it spin. They call it propaganda. And it really has very little to do with reality. They just simply need this to be true to promote whatever product they're selling, whatever purpose they have in mind, whatever wars they want to create or the like. I've been doing this for centuries with propaganda. Now the problem then is that this has all become totally pervasive. There are no referees for, and in particular of late, politicians are becoming self-styled scientists and promoting scientific disinformation. They just simply make up scientific information. This is very common in climate science. It's very common in medicine. It's particularly common in economics. So now one of the problems is that there are no decent fact checkers available. How does a fact checker know what is true and what is not? He can't. And this has particularly become apparent with these new programs like ChatGPT. It is better at spreading disinformation than the program's authors. It just simply makes up stuff as it needs it. It can't even do arithmetic. It is so stupid. Nonetheless, it can lie, it can cheat, it can fabricate references. There's a recent article in the New York Times I was reading where some poor lawyer submitted a brief to a court that was written by ChatGPT, and the judge looked at it and was a little bit skeptical, and he noticed that virtually all of the citations in the brief were fabricated. None of them were true. I think the lawyer is being disbarred by the judge for having done so. There's all kinds of scientific disinformation, and nobody knows what's right and what's wrong because it's all built into the literature, and there seems to be no way of determining the difference. Like, for example, everybody knows you can fly faster than the speed of light. I mean, the Star Trek, the Enterprise does it. All you need is dilithium crystals, so it's got to be possible. No, it's not. This has become such a serious problem. The Nobel Committee has set up a panel to try to figure out how to deal with it. They unfortunately are modeling it after the IPCC. I think that's a big mistake for them to do that, because the IPCC has become one of the worst offenders, proliferation of pseudoscience. Well, in their case, I think it's just bad science. They until more recently, originally it was just incorrect science, but now it has become politically inspired and required to be defended.
And in fact, this is reflected to some extent in the findings of Dr. John Ioannidis from Stanford, where he saw, a lot of contemporary scientific literature just doesn't checked out under closer scrutiny.
Oh, yeah. For sure. I mean, nutrition is also another field where all of this is under the influence of the associated industries, each one using it for competition with the other. Well, eating that food is bad for you. That's being promoted by the other foods industry. Sort of one of the famous ones is the pork, the other white meat. I got a prize for that one.
So you've started working with the CO2 Coalition, presumably because you want to, promulgate your findings here, and so what is your vision for what you want to do?
Well, they invited me to join. I agree with their message. It's not clear yet that they agree with mine. Their point has been that CO2 is actually beneficial. I personally agree with that. That in fact, like for example, if I understand, if you pump CO2 into a greenhouse, you can dramatically increase the growth rate of the plants inside. It's actually beneficial in many ways, and it seems silly to try to limit it. For example, when the dinosaurs roamed the Earth, the CO2 levels were 10 times bigger than what we have, what we experience right now. Dinosaurs could not have survived on this Earth with this low CO2 level, because you don't grow trees fast enough and foliage fast enough to feed them. They are big and they have big appetites and eat lots of stuff. And you need the high CO2 in the atmosphere to to feed them. College buddy of mine at Caltech was instrumental in this, a fellow named Art Robinson, who founded the Heartland Institute, promoting CO2 as being actually a beneficial gas. As far as I can tell, there's nothing wrong with it, and in particular, it is what I have just mentioned earlier. It is not at all significant in controlling the Earth's climate.
So what's the bottom line? What should we be doing here, in your view?
Number one, all of the programs, of which pervade virtually every part of the government, especially EPA policy, energy policy, all of them are all set to limit CO2 in the atmosphere, in the environment, and methane in the environment, and they are huge, massive waste of very valuable resources that could be being used for better humanitarian purposes. But there's a total waste of money and time and effort, and it is strangling industry. EPA policies are a total disaster. All of these policies should be stopped immediately, in my opinion. My suspicion is what I am saying here will be totally ignored because people don't like being told that they've made big mistakes of this magnitude.
Well, and this is what I was going to ask. What are policymakers saying to you as you've been reporting to this to them, or perhaps others have been sharing, what you've been talking about lately?
Well, I had a very brief conversation on my way to Stockholm with Joe Biden in the Oval Office, and I only had a few minutes to mention all of this, and his comment was, "It sounds like right-wing science." Beyond that, haven't gotten very far.
Perhaps a final thought, Dr. Clouser, as we finish?
I haven't the faintest idea how you correct the disinformation problem. That is, I think, the most serious problem there is. I would hope that government policies regarding climate change get changed. I'm pessimistic whether that will happen, but I still want to paraphrase Everett Dirksen. A trillion here, a trillion there, so you're talking real money. And I think this is a very serious problem that needs to be corrected.
Well, and I'll just make a comment here, a final comment on my end. You mentioned that the scientific disinformation is one of the biggest problems. You don't know how to deal with that. Well, very often so-called disinformation is created or distributed in the name of fighting disinformation. So it gets even more complicated.
Well, one thing that nobody seems to have noticed in this regard, with the rise of information technology and in particular in artificial information, there has been another elephant in the room that no one seems to have noticed. In the old days, we used computers to balance our bank accounts, to do accounting, to do marvelous things, and to do scientific calculations. Computers have had millions and millions of applications and have totally revolutionized the world. The primary value that they had was they didn't make mistakes. The arithmetic is always correct. The sneaky thing that has somehow been sneaked through by information technology is our acceptance of computers that make lots of mistakes. I have had a friend who wrote a program to evaluate very simple formulas for yacht race finish times. He put in the formula, and he used ChatGPT to generate this. ChatGPT couldn't even do arithmetic correctly. What its own formulas it could not evaluate. The big problem with artificial intelligence is that it makes tons and tons of mistakes. And even worse, it uses the online data as its source material, and it hasn't the foggiest idea which is fiction and which is nonfiction. The big transition has been from computers that never made mistakes to computers that make massive numbers of mistakes. It couldn't tell you whether or not it's possible to fly faster than the speed of light. And somehow the big con by the artificial intelligence industry is conning us into accepting this as, oh, well, of course, well, yeah, they do make mistakes, but we're working on that. So I think that is a very serious problem. That I will blame squarely on artificial intelligence. I think it's a catastrophe.
You know, I do want to ask you one more thing, and this artificial intelligence actually does figure into this. Over the last several years, especially during the last 3 years, there's been a lot of censorship of scientific opinion and scientific areas. And one notable example, you know, you had Stanford's Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, Harvard's Martin Kulldorff, and Oxford's Sanjay Gupta. They co-wrote an alternative view, right, on to the scientific orthodoxy, you know, called the Great Barrington Declaration. And this was censored. They were called fringe epidemiologists. There's this sort of culture of censorship. I wonder if you noticed this, and what is your reaction to that?
Some of the work of climate change has been censored. I was recently invited to present pretty much what I talked about on your program by the International Monetary Fund, World Bank group in Washington. And once they heard apparently my talk in Korea, that I mentioned that I was skeptical of climate change, they summarily canceled the talk. And this was done by the director of the office, Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF. And I was told that he was under pressure to cancel my talk or postpone it to some later date. It has not been rescheduled to my knowledge yet. And they wanted to change the format to have somebody around for rebuttals, I guess. I don't know. But they just simply decided that, no, they didn't want to hear it.
I guess my question is, you know, do you think that it's okay to censor, you know, certain scientific opinion for political reasons? Do you have it?
Good Lord, no.
or for, you know, because ostensibly
it's right out of Fahrenheit 451. You know, the book burning. We have been through book burnings in the past. They have been catastrophic.
Okay.
This is kind of this goes clear back to Galileo, who was threatened with being burned at the stake for the fact that he was disputing the Vatican's opinion on orbital mechanics of the solar system. And so, fortunately, he decided, okay, I'll stop. Given the alternative of being burned alive at the stake, I'll stop writing about it. But fortunately, his writings on the subject survived.
Well, Dr. John Clauser, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Thank you. I'm happy to have been here and allowed to express my views.
Thank you all for joining Dr. John Clauser and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.